A man decided to take a shortcut through the park, an empty, silent place, almost forgotten by the city. But before crossing the wooden bridge, something made him stop. On one of the benches, almost hidden by the darkness, a woman was crying desperately. Beside her, a 6-year-old boy slept, leaning against his mother's lap. Not understanding the magnitude of the pain she carried, she seemed broken, like someone who had tried to be strong for too long. When the man approached and asked, "Are you okay?" she couldn't hide her pain. She said she had just been abandoned by her husband, that she had lost her job that week, and that she was being evicted. With a choked voice, she confessed something she had never told anyone. "I think God has forgotten me." You'll be surprised by the ending of this story. So subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment on where you're watching from, and let's get to the story. Daniel Morgan was 38 years old, a man of average height, with brown hair already beginning to turn gray at the temples, and eyes that conveyed a rare kindness, the kind you feel even before he opens his mouth. He worked as a supervisor at a logistics company, earning enough to live comfortably, but without luxuries. He lived alone in a small house in the suburbs of Portland, led a structured, simple life, and spent much of his free time serving at the neighborhood church. He wasn't a saint, he didn't think he was better than anyone. But he had something inside him, a peace that came from someone who had already faced his own storms, and knew he hadn't been alone. That December night, the cold stung his face. The wind whipped through the bare trees, lifting dry leaves along the path. Daniel was returning from the prayer meeting at church and decided to take the shortcut through Laurelhurst Park. Normally, that place was deserted after 9 o'clock at night. Dark, too quiet, even a little sinister, to be honest. But Daniel wasn't afraid. He'd known that park since he was a child. He'd walked there hundreds of times. But that night, as he approached the old wooden bridge that crossed the artificial lake, he heard something, a muffled sob, a cry that tried to be discreet but echoed in the solitude of the park like a silent cry for help. Daniel stopped. He looked around, and that's when he saw. On the third bench to the left of the bridge, almost hidden by the shadows of the trees and the dim light of the distant lampposts, a woman was crying with her face in her hands. And beside her, leaning against her lap with his head tilted to the side, a little boy slept, oblivious to everything. Daniel's first reaction was to keep walking. You don't meddle in other people's lives, right? Especially at night, in an empty park. But something inside him wouldn't let him. It was as if a voice whispered deep in his soul. Go ahead. He took a deep breath, adjusted his jacket, and walked slowly to the bench. The woman didn't even notice. She continued crying, her shoulders trembling, her breath ragged. Daniel stopped a few steps away and, in the softest voice he could manage, asked, "Are you well?" She suddenly lifted her face, startled, and quickly wiped away the tears with the back of her hand. But it was no use. Her eyes were swollen, red, devastated. She must have been about 32 or 33 years old, with blonde hair tied in a messy ponytail, a pretty face but marked by exhaustion. She wore a coat that was too thin for that cold, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers. Beside her, an old backpack and a supermarket bag with some folded clothes. That was all she had. I'm fine," she lied, wiping her face again, trying to appear strong. Daniel shook his head slowly, with the look of someone who has seen real pain and knows when someone is hanging by a thread. "No, I'm not. And it's okay not to be okay. Can I sit here for a bit?" She looked at him, suspicious at first, but there was something about Daniel that conveyed security. Perhaps it was his tone of voice, perhaps his calm demeanor, perhaps the sincerity in his eyes. She shrugged, somewhat too weak to resist. "Feel free." Daniel sat on the other side of the bench, keeping a respectful distance. He remained silent for a few seconds, simply gazing at the dark lake ahead. Then, without pressing, he said softly, "My name is Daniel, and if you want to talk, I'm in no hurry." She laughed, a short laugh, without joy, full of irony. "Talking won't solve anything." "Maybe not. But sometimes it helps just not to carry the weight alone for a few minutes. And that's when she broke down. Maybe because I was at my limit. Maybe because Daniel seemed genuine. Maybe because she had nothing left to lose. The words began to come out, quick, broken, laden with pain. My husband left me 3 days ago, out of nowhere. He said he didn't love me anymore, that he wanted to live his life, that my son and I were a burden. He'd been distant for 2 months, but I tried to save the marriage, and I tried to be better, to be what he wanted, but it was no use. He took his things and left. He didn't even look at Ethan. He didn't even say goodbye to his own son. She paused to breathe, her voice trembling. And this damn week, I lost my job. I worked at a coffee shop. The owner closed the business, and I was already behind on rent because my ex stopped helping a long time ago. This morning, the landlord knocked on the door and gave me 3 days to leave. 3 days. Daniel, and I have nowhere to go. I have no family here. My mother died 5 years ago. My father, I don't even know where he is. Friends, the few I had disappeared when they saw my life had become this mess. She looked at her sleeping son, tenderly stroked his hair, and her voice grew even lower, almost a whisper. I don't know what to do anymore. I tried to be strong. I tried to have faith. But I think God has forgotten me. The words fell into the silence of the park like heavy stones. Daniel felt his heart clench. He knew that pain. He had been there years ago, when he lost his wife in a car accident and thought he would never be able to get out of bed again. He knew what it was like to feel that God had turned his back on him. He knew what it was like to lose hope. He took a deep breath and, with a calmness that came from a place deeper than reason, began to speak. Not with rehearsed words, not with prepared church phrases, but with truth. My name is Daniel, as I've already said. But I didn't mention that 8 years ago I also thought God had abandoned me. I lost my wife. An accident. Drunk driving. She was coming home from work. She died instantly. And I didn't understand. I became angry with God. I stopped praying. I stopped believing. I spent months in such a deep hole that I thought I'd never get out. She looked at him, surprised. He continued, "But you know what happened. God didn't abandon me. He was just waiting for me to stop screaming and start listening. And when I finally stopped, he lifted me up. Slowly, carefully. He put people in my path. He brought me back. And today I know sometimes God allows us to hit rock bottom so we can discover that he's there too, waiting for us." Her eyes filled with tears again. "But what if I can't? What if it's too late?" "No, it's not," Daniel said firmly. "It's never too late, and you're not alone. Not now." He leaned forward slightly, looking into her eyes. "Let me help you. Today, right now. You need a place to sleep tonight. Hot food, security. I can offer that. I have a guest room. My house is simple, but it's clean and safe. And tomorrow we'll see what we can do. No commitment, no pressure, just a chance to breathe." She looked at him with suspicion mixed with despair. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." Daniel smiled. A sad but sincere smile. "Because someone did this for me when I needed it. And because I believe God put me here today. In this park. At this time. For you." She remained silent for a long moment. She looked at her sleeping son. She looked at the dark sky. And then, with a broken voice, she whispered, "Okay, I accept." And at that moment, without either of them knowing, something bigger than them was beginning. Daniel helped the woman to her feet, held her backpack, and waited while she gently woke the boy. Ethan slowly opened his eyes, confused, rubbing his little face with his small hands. "Mom, where are we?" "We're going to a warm place, my love. This is Daniel. He's going to help us, okay?" The little boy looked at Daniel with those big, sleepy eyes, but full of innocence. Daniel crouched down to his level and extended his hand. "Hey there, champ. Do you like hot chocolate?" Ethan's eyes gleamed slightly. "I like. Then come with me. At my house we have hot chocolate and warm blankets." The walk to Daniel's car was short, but filled with a heavy silence. She, who finally said her name was Sarah Mitchell, still seemed in shock, as if she couldn't believe it was happening. Daniel put her few belongings in the trunk, opened the back door for Ethan, and helped Sarah get in. During the 15-minute drive to his house, they barely spoke. Only the faint sound of the radio playing an old song, and Ethan yawning in the back seat. Daniel's house was on a quiet street, lined with trees and modest, well-kept houses. It was a white-painted wooden structure with a small front porch and a simple garden. Nothing ostentatious, but welcoming. Daniel parked in the garage, picked up Sarah's things, and led them inside. "Welcome. Sorry about the mess. I wasn't expecting visitors." Sarah looked around. The room was small, but tidy. A light brown sofa, a bookshelf with books and some picture frames. On the wall, a wooden cross. The smell of old coffee mixed with something that smelled like vanilla candle wax. A home. A real home. "It's not messy at all," she said softly, almost emotional. It had been so long since she'd set foot in a place that felt safe. Daniel smiled. "The guest room is down the hall, second door on the right. It has a double bed and a crib that I kept from when my nephew used to sleep here. But I think Ethan's outgrown the crib by now, right, champ?" Ethan laughed, still shy, but beginning to loosen up. "I'm big. I'm 6 years old." 6 years old? Wow. So you sleep in the double bed with your mother. Let me get some clean sheets. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, not knowing what to do. Ethan pulled her hand. "Mom, it's nice here." She held his hand tightly and felt the tears welling up again. But this time they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Daniel returned with clean sheets, pillows, and towels. He showed me the room, which was simple but cozy, a made bed, an old but well-kept dresser, light blue curtains. He showed me the bathroom, said I could take a hot shower, use whatever I needed, and then he went to the kitchen to prepare the promised hot chocolate. While Sarah helped Ethan change and wash up, Daniel heated milk, mixed in cocoa powder, and added a touch of cinnamon. He also prepared some simple ham and cheese sandwiches. When the two left the room, they found Daniel setting everything down on the kitchen table. "I know it's late, but I think a hot meal will help me sleep better." Ethan climbed onto the chair and devoured the sandwich as if he hadn't eaten in days. And perhaps he hadn't. Sarah ate slowly and silently, but Daniel noticed she cleaned her plate. After the snack, Ethan started to doze off again, and Sarah took him to his room. When she returned, she found Daniel washing the dishes. "You don't have to do that," she said, embarrassed. "I know, but I'm doing it anyway." She stood in the kitchen doorway, hugging her own body as if trying to protect herself from something invisible. "Daniel, I don't know how to thank you, really. You don't even know me." And yet, he dried his hands and turned to her. "Sarah, I didn't do anything special. I just did what anyone should do. Help. And look, I know you're scared. Trusting strangers isn't easy. But I promise you, you and your son are safe here. And tomorrow we can talk calmly, see what can be done. But for today, just rest, okay?" She nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you. Seriously, thank you." He smiled and nodded. "Good evening, Sarah. If you need anything, my room is the last one down the hall. Just call." She went back to the room, lay down next to Ethan, who was already fast asleep, and for the first time in weeks, felt that maybe things could get better. In the following days, Daniel didn't pressure Sarah to go out. He would leave for work in the morning, return in the late afternoon, and always brought food, talked to her, and play with Ethan. Gradually, Sarah began to open up. She talked about her marriage that had fallen apart, about how she had come from a small town in Oregon to Portland thinking she would build a happy family. She talked about the dreams she had and how everything had collapsed. Daniel, in turn, spoke about his own pain, about the wife he lost, about the years of mourning, about how faith had been the only thing that held him together when everything seemed meaningless. And Sarah listened. and began to understand that perhaps God hadn't forgotten her. Perhaps he had only waited for the right moment. At the end of the first week, Daniel introduced Sarah to his church pastor, who knew people in the community. In less than 10 days, they got her a job at a local bakery. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Daniel offered for her and Ethan to stay at his house until they saved enough money to get settled. She hesitated, afraid of taking advantage of his kindness. But he insisted, and she accepted. The months went by. Sarah worked hard, saved every penny, and slowly rebuilt her life. Ethan adapted quickly. He started calling Daniel Uncle Daniel, went to school enthusiastically, and came back excited. The house, which had once been silent and empty, now had life, laughter, conversations, family dinners. And between Daniel and Sarah, something began to grow. At first, it was just gratitude, respect, admiration, but with time, it became something more. Gazes that lingered a little longer. Smiles that meant more than words. Conversations at night, after Ethan fell asleep, about dreams, fears, faith, the future. It was on an April night, 6 months after that encounter in the park, that Daniel finally mustered the courage. They were sitting on the porch, drinking tea, looking at the stars. Sarah commented on how life had changed, how she never imagined she would be there, happy again. Daniel took a deep breath and said, "Sarah, I need to tell you something." She looked at him, curious. He speaks, I fell in love with you." The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Sarah's eyes widened, unsure what to say. Daniel continued, nervously, "I know it might sound crazy. I know you've been through a lot, and I don't want to pressure you. But I can't pretend anymore that what I feel is just friendship. You and Ethan, you brought life to this house, to me, and I want to take care of you. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because I love you, truly." Sarah felt tears welling up, but this time, they were good tears. She held his hand, squeezed it tightly, and with a choked voice, said, "I love you too, Daniel. And I'm afraid to admit it because I'm afraid of losing you again. But you taught me to have faith. You taught me that God doesn't abandon you. And I believe that God brought me to you that night, because he knew I needed you. And maybe you needed me too." Daniel smiled, his eyes shining, and pulled her into a tight hug. And there, on that simple porch, under the starry Portland sky, 2 broken hearts began to heal. Together, a year later, in a small and moving ceremony at the same church that had helped Sarah start over, Daniel and Sarah were married. Ethan was the ring bearer, proudly dressed in his navy blue suit, carrying the rings with a smile that lit up the entire church. There was no luxury, there was no ostentation, but there was love, faith, family, and the certainty that God had orchestrated every detail of that story. After their wedding, Sarah and Daniel's life became a journey of joint rebuilding. They transformed their house into a true home. Sarah brought color and life to every corner. New curtains, plants on the balcony, family photos on the walls. Ethan got his own room, painted light blue with bright stars on the ceiling that Daniel carefully glued on, so much so that the boy slept every night gazing up at them in wonder. The house that once echoed with silence now overflowed with laughter, conversations at the dinner table, and prayers before bed. Daniel officially adopted Ethan. It was an emotional, bureaucratic, and sometimes frustrating process. But it was worth every second when the judge banged the gavel and declared, "Ethan Mitchell is now legally Ethan Morgan." The boy, who was now 7 years old, didn't fully understand the meaning of it, but he understood enough to hug Daniel in the middle of the courtroom and say, "Now you're really my dad." And Daniel, holding back tears, replied, "I always have been. Champ, I always have been." Years passed and the family grew. Not in number. Sarah couldn't have more children due to medical complications, but in love, purpose, and impact. Sarah went back to school, took a technical course in administration, and started working at her own church, helping organize events and support vulnerable families. It was as if all the pain she had experienced was now transformed into fuel to help others going through the same thing. Daniel continued working at the logistics company, but dedicated a good portion of his free time to a project born from the heart. A small temporary shelter for homeless families, set up in partnership with the church. The name, Banco da Esperanza, Bank of Hope, a tribute to the place where it all began. Sarah was the first to suggest the name, and Daniel thought it was perfect. The shelter operated in an old house donated by a church member. It wasn't large, it could only house 3 families at a time, but it was safe, clean, and full of love. Sarah and Daniel took turns visiting the families, listening to their stories, offering emotional and spiritual support, helping them find jobs, providing clothes, food, and above all, hope, because they knew, better than anyone, that sometimes the only thing separating despair from a new beginning is a helping hand at the right moment. Ethan grew up in this environment of service. At 10 years old, he was already helping to organize donations. At 12, he talked to the children of the sheltered families, played with them, shared his toys. He knew, even without anyone needing to explain, that his life could have been completely different. And he was grateful, deeply grateful. One winter night, almost 10 years after that meeting in the park, Daniel and Sarah were in the kitchen preparing dinner. Ethan had gone out with friends from church to watch a basketball game. The house was quiet, only the sound of the pot on the stove and the soft music playing on the radio. Sarah was chopping vegetables. Daniel was seasoning the chicken. Suddenly, she stopped, looked at him and said, "Do you remember that night?" Daniel smiled, without needing to ask which night. "I remember. Every second." Sarah dropped the knife, wiped her hands on her apron, and approached him. "And I was so scared that night, Daniel. I was so lost, so hopeless. And I remember that before you showed up, I prayed. For the first time in months, I prayed. It wasn't a pretty prayer, no. It was like a cry of despair. I said, 'God, if you exist, if you still care about me, send someone, please.' And then you showed up." Her eyes filled with tears. "And I spent years thinking it was a coincidence, but it wasn't. Was it?" "It wasn't a coincidence." Daniel cupped her face in his hands, looking deeply into her eyes. "It wasn't a coincidence. It was God. I had no reason to go through that park that night. I always took the other way, but something made me change my route, and I know it was God, because He knew you needed help, and He knew I needed a purpose again." Sarah hugged him tightly, and they stood there, in the middle of the kitchen, simply feeling each other's presence, and the presence of God, who had never abandoned them. Time continued to pass. Ethan graduated high school with honors and earned a partial scholarship to study engineering at a state university. In his high school commencement speech, he thanked his parents, and when he said, "My father, Daniel Morgan," his voice trembled, but his pride was evident. After the ceremony, Daniel hugged him and said, "I'm the proudest father in the world, son." Sarah and Daniel continued serving at the shelter. They helped dozens of families over the years. Some managed to get back on their feet. Others returned to homelessness. But all and without exception, carried with them the message that God does not abandon, that even at rock bottom, He is there, waiting, caring, preparing the miracle. One summer afternoon, Sarah and Daniel returned to Laurelhurst Park. It had been years since they'd been there. They walked slowly to the wooden bridge and then went to the third bench on the left, the same bench where it had all begun. They sat side by side, holding hands, looking at the lake that sparkled in the sunlight. "It seems like a different life, doesn't it?" Sarah said softly. "It seems so. But this is where our real life began." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Thank you, Daniel, for not driving past that night, for stopping, for listening, for caring." Daniel kissed her forehead. "Thank you, Sarah, for accepting help, for trusting, for teaching me that God still performs miracles, that He still hears prayers, that He still puts the right people on the right path at the right time." They stood there for a long time, in silence, simply enjoying the peace of that moment. And then, as if it were a scene from a movie, but it was real as the love they felt, They saw a woman sitting on another bench further on, crying. A small child was beside her. And Sarah looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked at Sarah, and they both stood up at the same time. Because they knew what to do. They knew what the purpose was, and they knew that God was, once again, orchestrating something greater. Daniel approached slowly, with Sarah beside him, and in a calm voice full of love, asked, "Are you well?" And the story began again. Not the same story, but a new one, with new characters, but with the same God, the same love, the same hope. Because God never abandons, He only waits for the right moment, and when that moment arrives, He sends someone who is willing to stop, to listen, to extend a hand, someone like Daniel, someone like Sarah, someone like you can be too. Today, Sarah lives a completely transformed life. She is no longer that desperate woman crying alone on a park bench. She is a wife, a mother, a servant of God, and a living witness that miracles happen. Her son, Ethan, calls Daniel Dad with pride and genuine love. They serve together in the church, helping other families who have gone through the same despair. And Sarah understands now with crystal clarity that God never abandoned her. He was there on that cold December night, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right man, waiting for Daniel. And when the miracle finally arrived, it didn't come with trumpets or lights from the sky. It came in the form of a simple man with a pure heart who decided not to pass by, who decided to stop, who decided to care. And that's what changed everything. This story reminds us that God's miracles rarely come in the way we expect. Sometimes He doesn't remove the storm. He sends someone to hold your hand as you weather it. Sarah thought God had forgotten her, but the truth is He was preparing the perfect encounter, in the perfect place, at the perfect time. And Daniel, who had also experienced pain, understood that his complete healing would come from helping another person heal. In the end, what seemed like the end was only the beginning of something much greater. So if you are going through a difficult time, don't give up. God hasn't forgotten you. He is preparing your miracle. And when it arrives, you will look back and understand that everything made sense. If this story touched you, leave a like, comment what you thought, and subscribe to keep hearing stories like this. I'll leave another story here that I guarantee you'll also enjoy.